I'd like to welcome you all to the beginning of the Institute on National Affairs. And this week, our topic is Poverty in America, a Dream Deferred. And during the Institute this week, our speakers are going to focus on different aspects of poverty and how it crosses age and race lines and really affects all of us in some way or another. Tomorrow, we will be having student representatives and some administrators as well as state legislators speaking on the economics of education in the maintenance shop at noon. And due to the caucuses tomorrow evening, we won't be having a speaker, but we would like to encourage you all to attend your local caucus. And I would also like to remind you that on Tuesday evening, Charles Murray will be speaking at 8 p.m. in the sunroom. Tonight our speaker is Mitch Snyder. At age 26, Mr. Snyder walked off of a $50,000 a year Madison Avenue job as a management consultant for a more meaningful cause, homeless and poverty. He helped to form the Community for Creative Nonviolence in 1970, which started as a result of an anti-war movement. Now he runs the 2nd Street Shelter in Washington, and he conducts sit-ins and fasts for a cause that he believes very strongly in. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present Mitch Snyder.
Hello. For those of you who may be wondering why I look like the Hathaway man, it's some surgery that I had a few weeks ago. I had a detached retina, like Sugar Ray Leonard. So I can see a little bit. If I leave this off for any length of time, the light begins to bother me. I'm going to take it off now, though, because it throws off my perception. I'm not sure which way it works worst. Oh well. I appreciate your being here tonight, and I'm glad you're doing the week that you're doing. Obviously, it's important for people to focus in on issues and to educate themselves as to what's happening and why it's happening, what it all means. I understand a very good friend of ours is coming at the end of the week, a fellow named Coleman McCarthy, who's a columnist for the Post, who's a charming fellow, very fine guy, very consistent. When I walked in, somebody walked up to me and said, "Do you remember me?" And I didn't. Old age and senility was setting. But he reminded me, the last time I saw him, he was cleaning the bathroom on the 3rd floor of the shelter where I lived. I was in there taking a shower or something. And he told me that he was from Iowa. And there he is. That's impressive. You know, I don't often meet people in the Midwest, out in the West, that have been cleaning our bathrooms. Somewhat disconcerting, but interesting. Well, let me first share with you a bit about where I come from. Since, as I'm sure you understand, language is at best a very imperfect means of communication, because our use of or understanding or perception of words is to a great degree a product of our experiences, who we are. And so just to give you a little better sense of who I am and where I'm coming from, I'll take a moment to share a bit with you about that. I and Carol Fenley, who's sitting somewhere out there, I couldn't begin to see where she is, come from Washington, and we're part of the Community for Creative Nonviolence, which, as was said, came into existence in 1970 in response in opposition to the war in Vietnam. We're essentially a religious community, although not in the traditional or usual sense of the word. Religion is not a prerequisite for membership either. I mean, you don't have to be a religious person, although most people tend to be. And that's, to a great degree, the underpinnings out of which we build our work and our lives. There are about 50 of us in the community, 50 or 60, all of whom work as volunteers. None of us gets paid for what we do. But we have available to us the food and the clothing, and, the furniture, the buildings, whatever, that are donated and that we have available for serving people who are poor and destitute. We also have those available to us, and so that's how we live. Initially, we came together in response to the war in Vietnam, but we fairly quickly came to understand that there was a domestic counterpart to the violence of Southeast Asia. And for us, that domestic counterpart manifested itself most clearly in the existence within blocks of the White House, in the very epicenter of the Western world, of people who were forced to go to bed hungry at night. In fact, there were some who had no bed to go to. And in fact, for many years and under a number of presidents, the president's closest neighbor was a woman named Mary, who would sleep sitting up next to the gatepost going into the White House. We opened a soup kitchen back in 1972 as a result of those perceptions, and we began serving 200-300 people a day with a hot meal. We, again, fairly quickly came to understand that the person who comes in for a bowl of soup brings with him a pretty wide range of needs. And so now we serve somewhere around 2,000 or 3,000 people a day with food, medical care, dental care, mental health services, clothing, shelter, a pretty wide range of services and resources. And we operate a very large shelter. It's actually probably the largest in the world. It's 1,500 or 1,600 people, but very comprehensive. I mean, it's a fairly decent place to be. We just convinced people to spend $13-point-something million renovating it and making it a decent place to be. But we do that. Plus, we continue to very aggressively and actively involve ourselves in the shaping of policy and values and perspectives. We're still, as far as we're concerned, an anti-war community. We manifest that, for the most part, in somewhat different ways than we did 15 or 16 years ago, but nonetheless, we continue to involve ourselves in direct service to our neighbors and in involvement in, and when necessary, resistance to a pretty fair number of things. I think it could legitimately be said that homelessness in America is a crisis. Most experts would say that there's at least 3 million people on the streets. Most experts are saying that this coming year the number will increase by 25%, and they're everywhere. I mean, it's not just big eastern or western or midwestern cities. You know, where they are much more visible. They're everywhere. They're in every size city and town. They're living in chicken coops in the northernmost reaches of Maine, because the lumber industry is bellied up there. And whole families are out. They have no place to live, and so other families are letting them move into chicken coops. There's people living in caves in Appalachia. If you go down to Beverly Hills, you'll see bag ladies sitting on the benches on Rodeo Drive. In the suburbs, large numbers of people are homeless. And it should be understood that while most experts would say that there's 3 million homeless people on the streets, nobody knows how many homeless people there are on the streets. It would be as easy, if not easier, to count the grains of sand on the beach when the tide was moving out, because homeless people, in order to survive, have to be invisible. They have to disappear. They have to blend. We can't see them. If we see them, then we find them disconcerting, and if they disconcert us, we make them go away. And we don't usually do that in pleasant ways. Who are they? Who are these people that are in chicken coops and on streets and living in caves? In generalities, 10 to 15% are usually women. Most of the women, 70, 80% on average in most places, are mentally disabled. Families make up probably a third of the homeless population. Probably a minimum of 500,000 children out on the streets. Among the men, 50% are veterans and 50% of them are Vietnam era vets both widely disproportionate numbers. How did they get there? Well, obviously there's as many ways as there are people, because human beings are all individuals with their own histories and memories and personalities and strengths and weaknesses. But there are some fairly well-traveled paths to destitution. Unemployment, obviously, underemployment, and increasingly a minimum wage that has remained unchanged for, what, 5, 6 years now. People can't live on the minimum wage. At least 600 people in the building that I'm in work full-time. They get paid $3.35, $3.65 an hour. I don't know if you could live in Ames or Des Moines on $3.35 an hour, but you sure as hell don't live in Washington on $3.35 an hour, or $3.65, or $4 an hour. And so you have large numbers of people that are locked into virtual destitution because all they can make is enough to be able to buy a few things, among them not shelter. The depopulation of the mental hospitals was and is another significant factor. It's estimated that as many as a third of the people on the street are mentally disabled. As a result of a Supreme Court ruling 16, 17, 18 years ago that said that if you weren't dangerous, you couldn't be locked up all your life, which is what was happening. And people were being locked into some really rotten places. They called them snake pits, and I think that was an overly generous description. They were truly inhuman places, much like many of the shelters today, as a matter of fact. It's amazing how we just shun people from snake pit to snake pit. But the problem, of course, wasn't the depopulation of the hospitals. The problem was that part 2 of that decision was never implemented, the creation of community-based facilities, so people could live with minimal restraint and a reasonable amount of support and be contributing members of the community. Because everybody has something to contribute, and not least of all, people who we call mentally disabled. Living with a great many mentally disabled people, I can tell you that they have a great deal to offer, and we deny ourselves as much as we deny them by denying them the opportunity to do that. But that's put a lot of people out on the streets, that situation. Obviously, under this administration, over the last 7 years, the bottom has been cut out of social service programs. And so millions of marginalized Americans are being pushed inexorably over the edge. And they're winding up increasingly destitute, homeless. The proverbial choice of a place to live or food, clothing, medicine, whatever they may need. And huge numbers of people have been put in that position. But ultimately, of course, it's the near disappearance of affordable housing that's done the most to swell that population, and that is also responsible for the changing face of America's homelessness. Fairly soon, a year, 2 years maybe, the average homeless American will be a child. So the population is changing, and we're seeing all of those families and all of those people we didn't see before, because what's putting them out on the street is the absence of affordable housing. Now, why is that happening now? Why are so many people winding up out on the streets? Why is housing disappearing now? The obvious answer is that the federal government has completely disinvolved itself in the maintenance or creation of affordable housing. The budget for low-income housing has been cut 75% in the last 7 years. I mean, think of what it would mean if we cut the defense budget by 75%, or the education budget by 75%. We wouldn't dream of doing that, yet that was done. And so the federal government went out of the low-income housing business. The private sector did what it's supposed to do. I mean, the truth is that people don't go into real estate and development to get into heaven. They do it to make money. And you don't make money by building affordable housing. You make money by building condominiums and co-ops and office buildings and higher rent units. And so that's a pretty potent punch. You know, 1, 2. Federal government stops doing it, and the private sector just grinds all of that previously affordable housing down and makes it disappear. There's things called single-room occupancies. Sometimes they're called efficiencies. But they're small room, moderate room with little kitchenette and either a bathroom or a shared bathroom. And not a very fancy way to live, but a lot of people on fixed incomes and low incomes have been able to live in those places. There were a couple of million of them a few years ago. Now there's 1 million left, which means a million efficiency apartments that older people who were on Social Security and couldn't really make it in an apartment because they're too expensive and needed something smaller and less costly. Those, half of them have disappeared, and more are going. But it should be said that at the same time that they cut the bottom out of the low-income housing budget from $28 billion a year back in 1931 to less than $9 billion a year now, just about $8 billion, they were increasing subsidies to essentially middle and upper income people through tax benefits attached to home ownership, first and second properties. In 1980, the federal government lost $30 billion a year through these deductions. Now, this year, it will lose $46 billion. And so at the same time as support for lower income people was cut by 75% from $28 billion to about $8 billion, support for primarily upper income people, because the majority of people that avail themselves of these benefits earn over $50,000 a year. They're fairly well-to-do people. We've increased that subsidy from $30 billion to $46 billion, which is, of course, very inequitable. But what that succeeded in doing is creating a crisis of fairly major proportion, so bad that in a study recently commissioned by the Neighborhood Reinvestment Corporation, a congressionally funded group, not a particularly left-wing think tank, they did a study and they said that if federal housing policy remains essentially unchanged for the next 15 years, that by the year 2003, there will be an additional 18.7 million Americans who will either be homeless or who will be in imminent danger of being homeless, which means they'll either be living doubled and tripled up with other people, or they'll be living in totally substandard housing that would be unacceptable to any civilized person. Now, the truth is that even if Congress twisted itself into a knot tomorrow, coming up with legislation, which would cost probably $25–30 billion a year, to get us by the turn of the century to the point where there was adequate housing, Congress is not twisting itself into knots to do that. They are not trying to figure out how to spend that kind of money, where to find that kind of money, how to do it in a responsible fashion, how to do it in a way that doesn't drive up the deficit. Nobody's even talking about that. But if they were, and if they did it tomorrow, it would take a couple of years at least before we saw any real effect, because it takes time to create programs and to gear them back up and to get them back in motion. And the government, as you probably know, moves very slowly. And the bigger it is, the more cumbersome it is, of course, the slower it moves. And that thing in Washington is like this huge cow just stuffed, unnaturally so, lumbering along and, moving with all the speed of a South American tree sloth. So the truth is that before things start to get better, if they're going to get better at all, inevitably we're going to have 5 to 10 million people on our streets. And the United States is going to look a lot like third world nations, at least that part of it. And that's insane, because we're 5% of the world's population, and we're consuming 50% of the world's wealth, which makes us the wealthiest nation the earth has ever seen. We make Rome and Greece look like pikers. I mean, our control of resources is the likes of which nothing has ever been seen of before, and hopefully never will again. Now, although we being CCNV, began operating a soup kitchen in 1972, our real involvement with homeless people started in 1976 when we opened up one of the buildings we were living in as an overnight shelter. And every night we would go out and bring back 40 people and we would fill up the first floor. It was a really crazy time in our community. We had a family of 15 living in a couple of rooms. They'd been evicted and nobody could find a place for them to go. And so we squeezed them in. We had 10 or 11 students living in the basement who were black students who had been thrown out of a southern college. too radical, and they were pretty radical. They made us nervous at times. But they were nice folks. They were living in the basement, and there were about 15 or 20 of us in the community. And this is like an 8 or 9 bedroom house that we're talking about. And at night, there would be 40 people spread out all over the floor. After a while, we had people living on the roof. It was an amazing scene. But that's where our involvement with homeless people really began. Because as we reduced the distance between ourselves and them, when we not just served the soup in the kitchen downtown, but when we opened up the doors and said, come on inside, we began to develop the kind of relationship that makes inevitable the kind of things that we've been doing, and the kind of conclusion that we would seek, which means that it was very quickly out of that process that we decided that we would do whatever we had to do in order to guarantee that every human being in our city, initially, would have a roof over their head, and that roof would be offered with some degree of dignity. And it didn't take very long for us to realize that we had to make that same kind of commitment to the rest of the people in our nation. And it hasn't taken us long to figure out that we've got the same responsibility to people in other places, because we are primarily responsible for their being in that situation. Anyway, it's estimated, I believe, that 1/4 of the world's population lives in either no housing or obscenely inadequate housing. That's a lot of people. That's about 1.25 billion people. Awful lot of folks. When you consider it's completely unnecessary, it's something I think we need to come to grips with, all of us, quickly. We began to understand very quickly that we had an absolute responsibility to do what had to be done to allow those that we were serving to have available to them their legitimate right, which is to a roof over their head. Since any civilized society, anywhere, should and would articulate a commitment to a right to the necessities of life: food, shelter, medical care, clothing, and education, those things that you need to be a contributing member of the community. We didn't find a tremendous amount of support for the idea that people have an absolute right, a born right to shelter, and that we as human beings and citizens have had an absolute responsibility to do what needs to be done to make sure that people are afforded that right. Instead of support, what we found instead was a great deal of ignorance and fear, themselves, of course, the product of the awesome distance between those who have some place to lay their head and those who don't. What we found was that homeless people were, and to a great degree still are, missing persons, absent from our deliberations, our decision-making processes, our consciousness, and our lives. And so daily, in vitreous misery, they suffer and they die. Now, in order to reduce some of that distance and to make more concrete and visible what had been made very abstract, which was the human suffering, in fact, the human attached to that person, that thing sitting out there on the street. In order to reduce that distance, we felt the need, and there was the need, to speak and act prophetically and dramatically and symbolically. And so we did a number of things. We literally broke down doors on unused buildings, and we turned them into shelters, because we don't believe that anyone has a right, particularly the government, to an empty building when people are outside literally freezing. And so we would open up buildings. We occupied government buildings. We created tent cities for homeless people across the street from the White House, called them Reaganville. We served Thanksgiving dinner, and still do, to a couple of thousand homeless people every year, either in front of the White House or in front of the Capitol. We've conducted mock funerals. We've conducted real funerals. A friend of ours froze to death in Lafayette Park, died a few years back, a fellow named Jesse Carpenter, who died because he stayed outside with his friend who was in a wheelchair, who couldn't get into the shelters because none of the shelters, at least at that time, would accommodate wheelchairs. And so Jesse froze to death by staying with his friend. And it was discovered that Jesse was a war hero in World War II and did some very amazing feats. As a matter of fact, came back and became an alcoholic because of experiences in the war, and lost his family and everything, and wound up out on the streets. So we did a number of things like that. We were arrested and removed from churches during snowstorms, suggesting that closing the doors after the last Mass was not a good thing to do. Certainly wasn't religious. We were dragged out of those churches and arrested. We did whatever we had to do in order to begin to focus attention and to begin to open up some hearts and ultimately some minds. And so we marched, we sat in, we spent time in jail, we lived on the streets for months at a time, and we fasted. Now, we initially encountered a tremendous amount of anger and defensiveness and resistance, but haltingly, grudgingly, people began to see. And what some of them began to see were the homeless. They found themselves no longer able to rely on very comfortable and very familiar, but very old and very outdated and very irrelevant images and stereotypes, such as that homeless people are, quote, dirty, lazy, drunken bums, or they're out there because they choose to be out there. As those illusions began to melt for those people who began to get more involved and to began to see better, a growing number of people have come to understand the magnitude of the problem and the diversity of the people on the street. But while it's true that as a nation we've obviously become more aware of the existence of this problem and those people out there, it's also true that there's many more people on the streets than there were 6 months or a year ago. And no one could say with any degree of certainty that the improvements that have been made, the steps forward that have been taken, the growth in consciousness, has even kept pace with the increase in the number of people that are out there. What that says, what the existence of those people, the growing number of those people, and our unwillingness to really come to grips with it, what that is a living reminder that we have not yet in any substantial way begun to deal with either homelessness in America or what it represents, which is even more difficult to deal with. Now, I moved to the streets of Washington, D.C. for 4 months in the fall of 1980. I lived on a little heat crate, a slab of steel about 4 by 4 feet that had steam rising out of it, and that was fairly warm. And I lived on that for about 4.5 months. I was right in the middle of downtown D.C., right across from the Interior Department. Every morning I would see James Watt. He was the Secretary of the Interior at the time. He would come driving by in his limo, and he'd be reading the newspaper, and he'd always sneak a look. And I go, hey, and he would go right back to his paper. It was amazing. He'd go, snap right back. Never wanted to see me, but he had a hard time missing me. On very, very bitter nights, when it got really cold, occasionally I would wander over, if it rained, I'd wander over to the only public bathroom open in Washington at night, one by the Washington Monument. And what I would find, what you would find on any night, was that there were many men who sought refuge there. There in that obscene meeting place, these men came to find a little refuge, a little warmth, a little dryness. So they would be sitting on the stools, and the door would be closed, and most of them would be asleep. Occasionally, of course, the park police would come by and throw everybody out, and they would go out, and then, just like the tide, they'd come right back in, because they had no place else to go. And if it's cold outside, what are you going to do, sit there and freeze because a cop told you to do it? I mean, if you get arrested, what happens? You get warm. And I stood next to a man when I was out on the street who took off his shoe with a police officer standing 3 feet away, walked up to a little kiosk in the middle of Lafayette Park where during the day they would have a park person giving out information, answering questions. At night nobody was in it. He walked up, took his shoe, and smashed the window. And the cop said, "Why did you do that?" And the guy said, "Because it is cold out here, man, and I ain't going to freeze to death tonight. I'm going to jail. I'd rather do that." And that's true, and isn't that sad that somebody would break the law to go to jail because the alternative was so much worse, which was to be out on the street. But it was. Now, the sight inside that bathroom was revolting. I mean, it was absolutely disgusting. Not the people. I mean, just what was happening there and what it all meant. It was enough to make a person speechless with pity. See, you'd walk outside and not 100 yards away was the monument itself. This big, imposing thing sticking up out of the ground, bathed in light. And if you look the other way, not very far down the mall, was the Capitol. You know, and for those of you who've seen the Capitol, you know it's a very impressive sight. I mean, it's just raw power. It's empire. That's what it is. And the lights and the flags are flying and blazing, and you're surrounded by all of the trappings of power. You know, the power of empire. And there, in the midst of that, are people seeking warmth in a bathroom. The contrast, of course, the contradiction is that, that's what's represented by that scene with all of that power surrounding all these broken people in that sad little bathroom. The contradiction is that in the wealthiest country the earth has ever seen, millions of human beings, people just like you and I, because that's the truth, they are just like you and I. There's some differences, but the similarities are far greater and far more numerous. That those people are living and dying out on the streets. They're eating out of garbage pails, they're freezing to death, they're suffering horribly out there on the street, while we represent all of this wealth and all of this power. Now obviously, in the face of that, something is very wrong. And while I think many of us probably have expended considerable amounts of time and energy attempting to discern the root causes of poverty and injustice, most times what we refer to as the roots are in fact only the branches. The underlying truth with which we are very, very unwilling to come to grips with is that neither the existence of millions of homeless Americans nor the other manifestations of the injustice and violence within our society and our world, such as the fact that every minute 45 people die of starvation, most of them children under 5, the existence of nuclear weapons sufficient to turn the world into a giant ashtray and make it unlivable for anything. The fact that we are risking the ecology, which means the land, the air, and the water on which we rely for our continued existence. None of those things are aberrations. And that's the truth that we have a hard time coming to grips with. Those things are the logical, predictable, and inexorable consequence of our efforts to build a livable society on a foundation of unbridled greed and competition and individualism. It gives us exactly what we've got, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. It makes absolute sense that we have winners and losers. That's what A's and F's represent. It makes absolute sense that some people would eat off $2,000 plates and other people would be reduced to eating out of trash bins. It's not rational, and it's not human, and it's not safe or reasonable, but it is predictable. And in fact, it should also not be a surprise that we have managed to construct a society that is itself irrational, inhuman, and extremely dangerous. Now, it seems to me that if we're ever going to begin to come to grips with it and begin to make some inroads into dealing with that, we're going to have to acknowledge that we can't simply fine-tune our institutions or our values or our relationships. I mean, the truth is that no matter how much formaldehyde we pump into a dead body, it stays dead. At some point it deteriorates, and at some point it begins to stink. And that's what, in fact, is happening now. Now, it also seems to me that we can't begin to even hope to build a just and an equitable world, a world where all of us have available the necessities and the requirements of life and can live with peace and with dignity and with some degree of harmony. That will never occur unless and until we reduce the great distance between that which we say, the values that we profess, and the reality of our lives. I mean, it's that distance between what we say and what we do that is filled with all of the evil in our nation and in our world. See, the truth is, and I experienced, when I was out on the street for months at a time, watching people walk by and either not look at me, or if they looked at me within a nanosecond, this film would come down over their eyes, and I was gone. I was no longer there as a human being. We have to reduce the distance, not just between our words and our actions, but between ourselves and victims of injustice. Because it's in the reduction of that distance that we begin to develop the capacity to feel and understand. And that it's out of that that we become reluctant to allow people to be further abused. As we see more clearly what's happening, as people take on names and identities and faces and histories and personalities, we become less inclined to allow them to be hurt. Just like those we love, those we care for very deeply. We wouldn't dream of allowing to come to any real danger without doing everything and anything we could to help them or to avoid that danger. And so we've got to reduce the distance between what we say and what we do, and we have to reduce the distance between ourselves and those who are suffering and those who are oppressed. And that is not an original thought at all. That you may, if you think about it, we'll remember the invitation to walk with and serve and be with the lepers, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the people who are in pain, the people who are on the outside of the society. That's a suggestion that's been made many times by many people. Now, so we have to break down the walls and the multitudinous layers of bureaucracy that we've constructed to stand between us and other people. The problem, of course, is that when you do that, they not only stand between you and other people, but they stand between you and the truth. Those same walls tend to insulate, isolate, and segregate us from the truth, as well as from one another. And so our actions, our consciousness has to begin to flow out of our proximity to those people. It seems to me that we also are supposed to act without regard for the cost, because our consideration should be not the cost or even the consequence, but the rightness and the necessity for our actions. But we have to do the right thing to do, whether it's wise, whether it's judicious, that's immaterial. Whether it's effective, I mean, we don't begin to understand what effectiveness means anyway. All that we can ever be assured of is that we can no more do good without consequence or with impunity than we can evil. There's inevitable consequences attached to anything we do or don't do. We have to acknowledge, it seems to me, by the way we live, that there is something greater than ourselves, outside of ourselves. For those who feel comfortable calling God, I do, that's fine. But we have to acknowledge that force, that transcendent thing that puts us in our proper place and reminds us that we are simply members of the human community, equal members, and that the human community is but a very small part of a very large and coherent and beautiful creation. And we have to embrace and we have to endorse that which affirms that oneness. And we have to resist, and we have to dispel from within ourselves and expel from ourselves that which represents disunity and discord. Concretely, what that means, what that should mean, is that we act as though it's our sister or our brother sitting out there on the street in the cold waiting to come in, or it's our mother or our father, or our son or our daughter, or we ourselves, because the truth is, in some very magical way, that is our sister and our mother and our brother and ourselves. And until and unless we understand that and act on that understanding, we will be subjecting ourselves to as much that is bad as we are those who are stuck outside waiting to come in. It's a different kind of cost that we exact, but probably even more important and more critical than that which people are paying sitting outside waiting for us to wake up. So it seems to me that we have to act in ways that are rational and proportionate, and we have to act with a reasonable sense of urgency. What I mean by that is this. let's assume for a moment that while I stand here speaking to you tonight, there's a fire, bad fire, in New York City, and 30,000 people are burned out of their homes. What do you think would happen? Particularly in this kind of weather. It's not hard to imagine. The mayor and the governor would declare a state of emergency. The Red Cross and the Salvation Army would rush in personnel and supplies. Schools and churches and other public buildings would throw open their doors so that people could come inside. And instantly, efforts would be made to figure out what permanent solution could be created for those people who have now found themselves burned out. Well, as I stand here tonight talking with you, there are a minimum, everybody agrees, of 60,000 homeless people in the city of New York. 23,000 shelter beds. Which means a minimum, most people say it's probably 80,000 or higher, but a minimum of 37,000 people are stuck out on the street. 10,000 of them estimated to be children, waiting to come inside. Where's the sense of urgency? Where's the Red Cross? Salvation Army? Where's the mayor and the governor? Where are the churches and where's the gymnasiums? I mean, do you think it makes any difference to the person who got out on the street as a result of fire or earthquake or flood, or who got there because they're mentally disabled or not earning enough to afford a place to live, or because they're elderly? I mean, it makes no difference at all to them. They want to be inside. They want to come inside. But it does seem to make a tremendous amount of difference to us. The us that has the ability to create those solutions if we simply took it seriously. And we don't. And again, it's because there's that great gulf between us and those people. Someone who gets burned out, that's somebody like us. That could happen to me. I'm willing to acknowledge that because fire can burn anybody out. And those people, they're just like me. They look like me and they talk like me, and I want to help me and I want to see me help. And so sure, it's reasonable we bring those people inside because they shouldn't be outside. It's terrible. See, we can relate to them as human beings because we're relating to them as human beings. Those other things out there we're not relating to as human beings. Because if we did, we'd feel the same way and we'd make the same demands. And New York would be twisting itself into knots, making it possible for people to come inside short term and creating the resources that would enable them to stay inside long term. It also seems to me that if we are to have any hope of survival and any hope of creating a better community, a better country, that we have to begin to better understand the nature of change, both how it occurs and our relationship to it. Now, a couple of things that have helped me get some insight on change and how it occurs. A couple of years back, some of us, in 1984, some of us went on a fast, and it was a very visible thing. It got a lot of attention in the later stages. 2 days before the presidential election, the president agreed to help renovate the building that we had been operating as a shelter, this big federal building. That at the time the federal government owned. They've since given it to the city because they figured they could get rid of us with the building. But silly thought. So they gave the building away, and the president promised to renovate it and turn it into a model facility, which he reneged on right after the election. But after a couple of fasts and many, many demonstrations and marches and all the rest, there was agreement to do that. But in 1984, at this particular time, there was a lot of visibility, and so a lot of people were calling with different things. This fellow called me up, and he was calling from Denver. And he said, "Hi, I'm a man from Denver, and I work for a foundation. I represent a very wealthy family here in Denver that has a lot of money. And one of the family members, one of the principals in this foundation, had, as the others did, discretionary funds that she could just give away. They didn't have to go through the normal board process. And she worked as an aide for a senator, and she was very familiar with our work and with our shelter. And she wanted to give a significant sum of money to us. And so I said, oh, well, that's nice. Why don't you send it along? We can use it. And he said, well, no, it's not quite that simple. I'd like to come down and talk with you, and she'd like to come and visit the shelter. And so I said, sure, you can find me there. That's where I live. And so we arranged for him to come down a couple of weeks later, and he did. And we met on the steps of the shelter prior to this family member who worked up on the hill coming over. He wanted to chat with me a few minutes before she got there. And so we talked a little bit, and he was, I showed him around a little bit, and he was fairly impressed with what he saw. I mean, physically, the building was an absolute wreck at the time. I mean, at one point, we had 2 showers and 2 toilets for 1,100 people. I mean, it was just an absolute horror. Walls literally falling down. It physically was not a very pleasant place to be. But the spirit was, and still is, very good. Because it's run in a way that is the product of justice rather than charity. I mean, in CCNV, we abhor the idea of charity, unless it's the use of that word in the deepest, most spiritual, oldest sense. Kind of charity that's dispensed now we find truly degrading for all concerned. But justice dictates that people have a roof over their head, and if you believe that, then the atmosphere that's created out of that is a different one, and it's a different one because the people run their own building. There aren't any people that come in suits from other places. There's no paid staff. It's the largest shelter in the world, and there's nobody paid to run it. The people run their own building, and it's open all the time. Folks are free to come in. So he was impressed, and so we stood on the front steps and we talked a little bit, and he